John Collins is a Jazz man. The rookies had media. Let's hear what Andy Larsen makes of it all and what's next for the Jazz coming up on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Jazz Nation? My name's Leif Thulin with you again for Locked On Jazz for a little while longer. Excited, as always, to be talking with you guys, filling in for David Locke. You know me by now, but I'm a lifelong Jazz fan, credentialed NBA draft analyst for Locked On NBA Big Board, attendee of the 2023 Combine, Jazz statistician, broadcast assistant, someone who wants the Jazz to be as amazing as possible as the Jazz head to a critical juncture. We found out who our three picks are. The Jazz have just made a trade. You can see that the Jazz's gears are turning, and I'm here to navigate you through this big juncture in Jazz franchise history. Thanks for making Locked On Jazz your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Jazz, where the best way to help us grow is comment anything below. And today's question is pretty simple. What do you make of the John Collins trade? All right, in this, I'm joined by Andy Larsen, who is kind enough to join me again, just a couple episodes apart, and we're going to recap the draft. But in the first segment, we're going to talk about the obvious. John Collins, what does it mean for the Jazz? What can the Jazz expect? What does it mean for the future of Kelly Olynyk and Taylor Hendricks? In the second segment, Andy and I will discuss what the Jazz did in the draft. He was a Hendricks guy all along, and we'll see. We'll discuss what the Jazz are getting exactly in Taylor Hendricks, in Keyonte George, and Bryce Sensabaugh, and maybe what they talked about at media, because I wasn't able to attend, but Andy was. So you'll get some special insight before it's even posted. And in the final segment, Andy and I will break down the logjam in the backcourt, having added Keyonte George, Bryce Sensabaugh, and what this could mean for the likes of Jordan Clarkson, Collin Sexton, and THT, especially after adding the likes of John Collins, his $25.3 million salary per year. So welcome into Locked On Jazz, and thanks again for joining me, Andy. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm happy we got this to work, especially with a day that was a whirlwind for the both of us.
Yeah.
So let's just start with the trade. The trade seems like a no-brainer from my perspective, and it was John Collins, and it's a salary dump from the Hawks for Rudy Gay and a second-round pick. The Jazz got the best player in the deal and traded a player that they didn't have any future with in Rudy Gay, as well as a second-round pick. So from an assets perspective, that's a huge positive. And as far as I'm concerned, a huge positive regardless of what John Collins is, even if he's, the 13-6 guy the last couple of years or the 18-10 guy he was a few years prior. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. I mean, look, if he plays like he did last year, he's not worth $25 million on the open market per season, but given his age and given kind of his where he was as a player 2 seasons ago as a 20-8 kind of guy, I think it's the kind of risk that the Jazz should be taking with their free agent and cap space money. Frankly, like if I have to choose between taking this risk and spending $25 million on a John Collins or $25 million on an older Kyle Kuzma or an older Fred VanVleet, I'm going with the John Collins option, I think Will Hardy's shown an ability to, handle these kind of players well. I think it's fair to, there are some similarities between Lauri Markkanen and John Collins in terms of their skill sets. Obviously, they are different players on both ends of the floor. I'm not saying they're exactly the same guy, but I think there's some of that outside in mentality that Will Hardy can coach really well. I think for the Hawks was just a time where they realized, John Collins finally doesn't have any value. We're not going to get a late first round pick for him, and to start the move on process, because Quinn Snyder had started to limit his minutes in the rotation a little bit as the season went along. It'll just be interesting to see how this unfolds. But I love the bet from a kind of asset management point of view.
Yeah, and a couple other things just from a salary point of view is John Collins, though $25.3 million per year is a lot. The Rudy Gay contract is no longer on the Jazz book. That's $6 million back, so let's just say about 19. From my estimation, I could be wrong, that seems likely that Kelly Olynyk has reached the end of the tenure at the Jazz if you've got Hendricks waiting in the wings and you have John Collins taking the 4 minutes. Do you agree with that assessment?
I don't think I do. I would currently anticipate they keep Kelly, and we'll see. We asked, Danny Ainge and Justin Zanuck about that straight up once the season ended. So before those two picks, and they still thought that Kelly Olynyk was a value at his $11 million salary, and thought that he had more to offer. Thought that, essentially the nice thing about Kelly is that you can probably play him 5 to 10 minutes a night, or you can play him 30 minutes a night. And I think he's going to be kind of happy with it no matter what. He's not going to be angry about his role in the same way like a Rudy Gay might have caused problems had the Jazz not given him a larger role. I don't think Kelly Olynyk is going to be there. And I also think that Kelly Olynyk is not a terrible backup center option for the Jazz, where I think it's hard to put Hendricks there. And I don't think you've seen a lot of success when the Hawks have done that with John Collins in the past.
Okay, so that's an interesting perspective. I'll finish out the thought process that I was going to say is if Olynyk's not on the Jazz next year, then you take away that 11 and change off of the Jazz, and now you go from the 19 of 25 minus 6 minus 11, and now you have 8 million, and then you could potentially even stay positive in this because now there's a lot of players that the Jazz have to decide whether they pay. They may be active in free agency. They may be active in trades. And I think Jordan Clarkson and Collin Sexton and Taylor Horton-Tucker create a logjam. We'll get to that later. But let's talk about what the Jazz can feasibly expect in the short term and the long term with John Collins, because there's still 3 years on his contract. So the lineup that I see happening would be Walker Kessler, John Collins, Lauri Markkanen, Ochai Agbaji, and whoever the Jazz select to start at point guard. I think there's going to be a rotation, and that'll change throughout the year. So what do you see as Collins' role in particular?
Yeah, I think he's a really switchable defender, and so I think you can have him kind of on harder assignments than I think you can put Lauri Markkanen on. He's going to be kind of a rover 4 next to Walker Kessler for I think a large majority of those minutes. I think the goal is, the Hawks were so pick and roll heavy with Trae Young and either Collins or Capella. I think the Jazz want to use Collins in kind of more creative ways. And, Will Hardy's offense involved a lot with dribble handoffs, a lot of off-ball movement. Collins is really good at kind of those cuts and hanging out in the dunker spot when you can get him there. And kind of using his athleticism at kind of these well-timed moments. And I think a little bit some of the problem in Atlanta was he was kind of just cast aside into the corner more often than not. The extent that the Jazz can get him involved on the move, I think is going to be really key for whether or not this works out.
Here's an interesting perspective on this, and I actually hadn't thought about it that deeply, but you mentioned something at the beginning that Lauri Markkanen was kind of John Collins before John Collins in the terms of how Will Hardy made the most out of the situation of a guy who's talented, who's been a tertiary option, but he has the talent to be better. Well, they were in the same draft class. Lauri Markkanen went 7th. John Collins went 17th. John Collins in his second year averaged 19.5 points and 9.8 rebounds. Then in his third year, he scored 21.6 points per game with 10.1 rebounds. That's crazy production. Those teams weren't very good. But then in 2021, the Hawks made the Eastern Conference Finals. Like, it happened. I'm not saying that was repeatable, but it did. And he scored 16.2 points per game and averaged 7.8 rebounds per game. So, and actually, in fact, that was the next year. The year before was the one he did it. My years are off. 17.6 points per game and 7.4 rebounds. So he's productive on a winning team. That team may not have been sustainably winning for years to come. But I think the Jazz may have something better than what the Hawks made him out to be based off this trade. And, you're basically doing it for free. Like, Rudy Gay wasn't going to play for the Jazz next year. A second-round pick hardly ever pans out. Everyone says, oh, it could be Nikola Jokic. But it's not. It just doesn't happen that way. So anything's a positive. But if you get that type of production, and now you have him as a secondary, a tertiary option, and you have this ability to cultivate his talent into confidence. I think he became less confident last year, and that's why you saw his shooting numbers dip. I think you saw his counting stats dip. Do you think that this team has more versatility because of John Collins? And could you see a possibility where he plays as a primary option in secondary units, or is he just going to be kind of the secondary scorer of the starters should Jordan Clarkson move on?
No, I definitely see that, and we'll see what happens with the rotation. I do think it makes some sense to stagger Markkanen and Collins if you can, and get Hendricks on the floor with kind of both of those players and see what you have. I think he's going to be, obviously more offensively ready day one than Taylor Hendricks will be, and is a very different kind of, in terms of on ball shooter than Markkanen is, and so. I think you want to play Collins with a passing point guard as much as possible. And so I think it does depend who you start at the point guard position, right? Like if you run Chris Dunn off the bench, let's say, it might make more sense to play him with Collins than Collin Sexton. On the other hand, honestly, both of those guys are awesome in transition, and so that could be a lot of fun too. I do, yeah. As I kind of walk through it in my mind and kind of talk through it, like, that's kind of versatility, right? Like kind of the different possibilities you can try and see what works and what doesn't. And there's definitely going to be an experimentation process here. I'm not saying there's not. But yeah, just in terms of getting a good player on a iffy contract while giving up, I think, Rudy Gay is a negative contract. There's no doubt about it. I don't think the Jazz could have dumped him attaching a second round pick. And so that they kind of get it for negative value in return and get an interesting 26-year-old player, I like it a lot.
Yeah, the one downside that I could point to, and I'm unbelievably optimistic about this, so I'm very much on the positive, but if I were to play all sides of the coin, devil's advocate here, I would say if you're going to draft Taylor Hendricks ninth, and I had this podcast prepared to be talking about, okay, if Hendricks in 4 years' time is he's on his last year of his rookie deal with the Jazz, what do you anticipate from him? And we may explore that in the next segment. But now my expectations would be a little tempered because you've got 3 years of John Collins in front of him at the very, I won't say at the minimum because there's trades are possible, but likely. So what do you think this means for Taylor Hendricks? And I'll use an analogy to say what I think about it real quickly. It's like a college quarterback. You've got a luxury. You've got an embarrassment of riches. And, sometimes you got this guy who's really been solid for you. But if Hendricks is as good as the Jazz want him to be by picking him at 9, he'll play. And if he's better than John Collins, even if John Collins is the one that they're paying more money, then even more so he'll pay. So it's like recruiting over a talented recruit. It happens regardless. So I don't think Jazz fans should be worried that this stunts Hendricks horribly. In fact, I think it could help him, but I think maybe it'll make him less counting stat oriented. Like if you were to bet on counting stats, it's probably less so. But his development, I don't think this stunts him
right. His rookie of the year odds went down today. I don't think there's any real doubt about that. But I think you're absolutely right that I don't know that the Jazz were going to start Taylor Hendricks right away. Anyway, they didn't with Walker, right? I think essentially he's kind of the third guy in a 3 or 4 man rotation at the 3 and 4 spots. And I feel kind of okay with that, you can realistically get him 20 to 25 minutes a game. I don't think that you have to play John Collins 30 minutes a night. And certainly if he produces like he did last season. And yeah, frankly, if Taylor Hendricks is better than John Collins, then he's going to be on the floor more than John Collins. I don't worry about that. I think, again, you kind of have to worry about that with maybe noisier guys or guys who are problems in the locker room. By all accounts, John Collins wasn't that with Atlanta. Maybe he did. There was a time where he talked with Trae Young about wanting to get him the ball in kind of different ways in this film session that was reported by Hawks Media. But overall, I think kind of handled being in trade rumors for 2 straight years and kind of having a diminishing role really well from a personality point of view. Maybe not from an on-court point of view, but I think essentially having him in a new spot with a coach who's proven to be good with that kind of stuff in Will Hardy means that I think that it's going to be okay. And if not, I think that Jazz won't hesitate to move Collins or move whoever they need to in order to make those minutes happen. I think if Hendricks does burst right away, great. But kind of the idea of Taylor Hendricks is he's going to be role player good right away and need to develop the rest of this stuff, which I think he can still do off the bench or in a complementary role. Finally, I just say, look, last year the Jazz were really pretty healthy. You didn't see a lot of missed games from Larry Markkinen until the team was tanking. and same with Walker Kessler, same with Kelly Olynyk. I think if you see kind of a longer absence for either of those guys, that's really where Hendricks could get a huge opportunity.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And it's unlikely that Hendricks as a 19-year-old is going to be better than a 25, 26-year-old John Collins, who in his third year scored 22 and 10.
Right.
If he is, phenomenal. Coming up next, Andy and I'll discuss the selections of Taylor Hendricks, Keontae George, Bryce Sensabaugh, and where they may factor into the Jazz's plans, what Andy learned about them from today's media session that is fresh, and what's been said of them by the Jazz. But first, let me tell you about eBay Motors. When it comes to your vehicle, every part needs to fit just right. So next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits just right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Welcome back into Locked On Jazz. Leif Thulin with you here, and I'm joined by Andy Larsen of the Salt Lake Tribune, who loved the Taylor Hendricks pick, as we will discuss. And then we'll discuss the picks of Keontae George and Bryce Sensabaugh. So, Andy, just first question. You gave the pitch for why Hendricks was your favorite to begin with. I'll ask you kind of the same question just for Jazz fans. What can they be expecting, I guess, now with John Collins with this pick? Like, what is the appeal of having this player? And then I'll just have you add the nuance that the Jazz have added John Collins as of 4 hours ago.
Yeah, I think with, from my point of view, I think it's a brilliant fit because what he can do right away from a rim protection and defensive point of view. I think his timing on the defensive end, I think, was the best in this year's draft. The ability to fly in for weak side blocks, the ability to chase down blocks in transition. He's really a pretty darn remarkable athlete. I mean, I think there's real debate between kind of draft analysts, whether they feel the Thompson twins were better athletes than Taylor Hendricks, or if Taylor Hendricks was in that tier, or just slightly worse. But, I think is a top 10 athlete in this draft. But unlike a lot of athletic prospects who have a long way to go in terms of a lot of different facets of their game, I think there's one really obvious way he can contribute right away on the offensive end too, and that's by shooting the three ball. I mean, he shot 39% from deep last year, over 40% on catch and shoots. He's got the three-point shot right now and got a great form, kind of a quick form, very high release point with his length and height. And I love that, being able to just plug and play him right away in a pretty small offensive role, but one that's obviously very critical is spacing the floor. So I love the pick for the Jazz. I love that he fell to number 9, and love that he ended up in the Jazz's hands, even though I think I'm probably higher on him than the Jazz's front office was, a week ago.
Yeah, and I think even with John Collins in the mix, I think it is the same appeal. Like, people may overthink that, and maybe by year 3, if he's awesome, that then there could be questions of, is he prioritized? But there's a long way to go for that. I may have mentioned this to you last time, and I've said this on other podcasts, so I'm curious what you think of this. I've mentioned Jabari Smith Jr. as a comp, despite limited experience in the NBA. I know that's hard to do because you don't know exactly what his role will be, but it's a similar evaluation to me as a prospect. But he was categorized as a disappointment. But if I read you his raw stats for a rookie, I throw out the fact he was picked number 3, 13 and 7 on 41% shooting from the field, 31% from deep on a team that was just dysfunctional in terms of getting him shots. And their coach even said, hey, we don't get Jabari shots. And he shot 79% from the free throw line, meaning that he's a pretty good shooter at 6'10" and plus defense. I'd say that's a really, really good person to strive to be. And quite honestly, if they were in the same draft class, I would have had Jabari Smith higher than Taylor Hendricks. So the fact is, like, if he's someone that you can go after, there's only 4 players that have gone into a draft in recent years. It's Jaren Jackson Jr., it's Jabari Smith Jr., Taylor Hendricks, and Franz Wagner, and 4 other ones, Trey Murphy. So there's 5. that are 6'9" or above that are classified as this level of shooters and have plus defensive traits. It's pretty rare. That's rarefied air. The more I think about it, the more I agree with your initial pitch. I say all that to say this. Does talking to Taylor Hendricks give you an impression of what he strives to be? Is he someone that comes off as super ambitious, like I want to be the man, or is he like, hey, I'm really excited to fit in? Because I think he seemed humble from what I read and listened to about how he factors into an NBA team, and I just haven't heard it specifically for the Jazz yet.
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, he's a pretty quiet kid, right? Like he was reserved in our couple different press conferences we had with him. One, the day on draft day, and then today. I think and that's something that was confirmed by Bryce Sensabaugh, who's played AAU ball with him, grew up kind of in similar Florida basketball circles. I think what his role will be. All three rookies kind of mentioned they haven't had the role conversation with Will Hardy because they're trying to figure out the rest of the stuff of like, hey, moving to Utah, am I going to play in summer league? What can I do right away? They all three had on-court workouts with the Jazz today. So yeah, it's like I think I think it's I think it's fair to say it's to be determined whether he's wants to push for that kind of all-star potential or not. He's talked about needing to improve his ball handling, and I think needing to kind of improve his fit in a NBA offense, which is a very smart answer. It's also just very possible that like his agents fed him that answer, right? Like, because that is the right answer if you want Taylor Hendricks to be drafted as high as possible. So we'll see. I mean, that's some of like trying to figure out rookies and who they are and what they can bring. I think that's one thing I like about Taylor Hendricks is, even if there are mentality issues, which I don't think there are, but even if that were to be the case, he still has this pathway to contribute.
Yeah, and so I mentioned earlier that I had this planned out to ask you, what do you think he is right away, even summer league, rookie year, and then what do you think he is by the end of his rookie contract? It becomes a little more complicated with the addition of John Collins, but if you could give me just like an idea of what your expectation would be for his rookie year and then what you might expect by year 4.
Yeah, I mean, rookie year, I don't have a ton of expectation. I'm curious. I'm trying to think of a reasonable comp. I don't think he's going to have the ball in his hands a lot. I'm trying to think of one that makes sense for Jazz fans, but like, better. The Jazz just haven't had an awesome, for playing rim protection defense for a long time. I mean, the goal is like hopefully kind of rookie Andre Kirilenko in terms of being able to make an impact on defense. But, Andre was also 4 years older. So I just don't know that it's really fair to put high expectations on what he can be. For me, I think long-term, the hope is he's learns the defense well enough and can be as impactful as, kind of on the low side, a Jalen McDaniels, on the high side, Jaren Jackson Jr. and literally be the defensive player of the year. I think that's again the hope, but there are some of the similar traits there. And then offensively, you kind of hope that he goes in kind of the Jeremy Grant direction where maybe he takes better shots than Jeremy Grant, but he can put it on the floor and can be a threat for you, especially attacking closeouts.
Yeah, and I think we see that pretty much eye to eye. Let's shift and talk about the two guards the Jazz took in at both 16 at 28, Keyonte George and Bryce Sensabaugh. For the everydayers listening, I talked about film that I watched this weekend or rewatched this weekend that against NBA athletes. I watched Taylor Hendricks play Jarris Walker twice. And I watched, so I guess now 4 times. I watched Keyonte George play against Anthony Black and Jordan Walsh of Arkansas. And then I watched Bryce Sensabaugh play against Penn State because he was defended by Seth Lundy, who was a second-round pick. And I know Jet Howard would have been a fun one, but they didn't guard each other. So real quickly, I'm going to read you a sequence and kind of talk about Keyonte George, and then we'll discuss something. So Keyonte George, tie game, 53-53. Anthony Black's guarding him, kind of denying him. Keyonte George goes downhill, hits a floater off a screen going left. Next possession, they're up 2. He goes downhill, bangs into the big, finishes a floater, almost a layup from the left side with his right hand. Very difficult shot. Then he snakes the pick, same set, going left, snakes it back right, hits a 3, puts Baylor up 7, and he's the guy who hits the free throws up 1 to put it away. So Keontae George, to me, showed the very first time I saw him, reminded me of Jamal Murray, and then he did it against pro athletes in Walsh and Black. So the Jazz saw that. They saw a lot more from him. They've seen it from since high school. They've talked about all this ability to score. His diversified skill set is what Justin Zanuck said. What did you glean from talking to the Jazz, from talking to Keontae George about what his pathway to relevancy for the Jazz is?
Yeah, I think he's really. I think they think he's a really high potential kid who has a lot of different, obviously things he needs to improve on and the efficiency side of things. But Justin Zanuck really believes in his character and kind of the skills he showed out on the floor. And I think you kind of wrapped it up with kind of that sequence there, just the ability to score in multiple different ways. I think we talked to him a little bit today about his role in the NBA and kind of knowing right away that, hey, he's probably not going to be a 30% usage guy like he was at Baylor, right? Like he's going to be an NBA rookie off the bench and probably going to be struggling for playing time even at times, right? Like, so how do you find a role to work in those situations? And of course, it comes down to like catch and shoot shooting. It comes down to being responsible with the ball when it matters. And then, using your innate skill set, showing what you do at a high level. And that I do think that he has shown a pretty good attitude about it. Like, hey, I know it's going to be different in the NBA, and I don't want to put a ceiling on my potential, but he said he really wants to contribute, find a way to make it work in year one. And so you with kind of these scoring guard high usage types, you're always kind of worried about how they take to that transition and what they find their NBA skill set is. And it feels like Keontae George is really willing to do that.
So we're going to discuss this in the next segment about how there's a logjam at guards. But what do you think in 4 years would be a reasonable expectation for Keontae George? Because year one, there's going to be a difficulty getting on the court as a rookie, much less with the logjam.
Yeah, I don't know. I honestly, for the number 16 pick, and especially kind of for what Keontae is, I think there's a pretty wide gap between if this goes well versus if it goes poorly. I think if it goes well, you have talked about like the comparison to Jamal Murray. I do kind of see some of that ability to get his own shot, and obviously we'll have to improve a ton in order to get to there, or even kind of like a sub tier of that. I don't know, a D'Angelo Russell or something like that.
Yeah, a CJ McCollum or something.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's probably better. But the below, there's a real chance that he's just like a bench scoring guard, right? Like that, and Malik Monk type, if you will, and that's totally possible as well. So I think it's good for Jazz fans to have like kind of limited expectations of these guys, especially right away, because they are 19, they are freshmen. They're not going to like necessarily get starting roles in the NBA right away, and we'll see. Some of them are going to be good, and some of them are going to be, the more likely than not than one of these guys that the Jazz drafted on last Thursday is out of the league in 5 years, right? Like that's just kind of the math of the draft. I would say I think there's enough ways again that Keontae George can score in the NBA that like worst case, I hope that he's kind of a 3-point threat and can figure out a way to contribute on that end. The defense is going to be a real question mark. I guess what I'm saying is I don't have a great comp for you, Leif, in terms of like what I hope he's going to be. I just kind of hope that, to me, the biggest thing, again, is with high usage guards, getting mentality right, getting over themselves, figuring out what they do at the NBA level. And I think that Keontae's, at least so far, so good in terms of what we're hearing from him on that.
Yeah, and that's a tough question, and intentionally so, just because initially when you look at the draft, you're like, okay, what can this guy be right away? What can it be down the road? It's just more complicated than that, especially today when there's a trade that makes a lot of things in flux. Real quickly before we move on, I just have a stat for you about Bryce Sensabaugh, and want to hear if your just initial thoughts on him. Nothing too complicated. Sensabaugh was one of 7 freshmen since 2003. Averaged 15 plus points, 50% on 2-point field goals, 40% on threes, and 80% from the line, joining Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Kyrie Irving, Ben McLemore, Mike Daum, and now his current teammate, Lauri Markkanen. So I'm not saying he's going to be like those guys, but what is just your takeaway of the Jazz getting a guy like him at 28?
Yeah, just like was a ridiculous shot maker last year, right? Like, and at the highest level, like you say, like with some of the best stars we've seen in this league, just taking tough shots and making them. And that does usually translate really well to the NBA level. The thing is, honestly, the scary thing about Bryce Sensabaugh is more that the film doesn't look as good as it did for those guys, right? Like in that he is a little bit more athletically limited. He's not. These are tougher shots than you think. He's not getting huge elevation. And a lot of times there's a hand in his face as he's taking these shots and making them. So it's like, is that a small sample size thing? Will it still work in the NBA level when you have, rather than a hand in your face, a hand right by the shot release? We'll see. But I think it's a reasonable bet, and especially a reasonable bet at 28 to say, hey, let's get an elite guy at just putting the ball in the basket. He's got to improve defensively. He's got to improve in terms of kind of the team construct. I think he's a little bit underrated in his passing, but, it just will have to be there. I think there's the comp I've heard and that I kind of like most from is TJ Warren as like a way.
I said that a while ago. That's my favorite one.
As a guy who, but TJ Warren's an interesting one because it was a really important scorer for the Suns and Pacers for a couple of years, and then has dropped off once the teams that needed his role player skills him to need to be more. He'll need to be more at some point. So whether or not he brings that along and whether or not he focuses on those things will kind of again depend really determine his NBA future.
Yeah, and he's probably a better shooter coming out of college than TJ Warren, but we'll dive into some of that coming up next. Andy and I'll break down the logjam in the backcourt after having added George Sensabaugh and what it could mean for the likes of Jordan Clarkson, Collin Sexton, and THT, especially after adding the salary of John Collins. But first, a word from Murdoch Hyundai. Murdochs have been in Utah for over 80 years. Talk about longevity and dependability. Hyundai is the best car for your money. Safety features, bells, whistles, and all. Amazing cars for amazing prices. The SUV lineup features the Kona, the Tucson, the Santa Fe, and the Palisade. And I've heard nothing but rave reviews from them. And I know personally that there's been some interest in acquiring a new car in my family. We've definitely been looking. The Ioniq 5 Electric was named the Motor Trend SUV of the year by Motor Trend. The new Ioniq 6 is even better. It's amazing. Electric, it's sleek, and it looks just like a Porsche, just won the World Car of the Year. Some people may know more about cars than me, but that sounds like a pretty good working car right there. There are 3 amazing locations, all of them with impressive inventory and an amazing staff in Linden, Murray, and Logan. Welcome back into Locked On Jazz. Still Leif Thulin and still Andy Larsen, kind enough to join me on a big day. We've talked on draft day and when the Jazz made a trade. So Andy's the big game player right here. I'll just ask it quite frankly here. What does Collins mean for 2 veterans for the Jazz, Kelly Olynyk and Jordan Clarkson, if anything?
I think I don't know that it means a lot. It really kind of depends. If the Jazz see that there are any free agent options out there that they like, I think there are a couple of different possibilities. I think it still makes sense for Jordan Clarkson to opt out of his contract, given that the potential to add more years to his deal and kind of, again, extend that security. Again, Kelly Olynyk, I think the Jazz do intend to keep and should probably keep at that salary number. I do think he is a tradable contract and does provide value at $12 million. I am very curious about Taylor Horton-Tucker's decision. Frankly, I don't think he was a quality enough player to make more than the $10 million he made last year. But I do think that you look at the potential of 22-year-olds and say, okay, with an extra bit of wisdom in his game and an extra bit of shooting ability in his game, all of a sudden that looks like a real discount, and maybe a team buys into that as a possibility, buys into that as like, hey, let's just take a swing on a young guy. I think it would make a lot of sense for someone like the Wizards, for example, to make that kind of deal. So I'm don't know. I don't think, because the Jazz had so much cap space to begin with before the John Collins deal, I don't think that really desperately changes their decision making on this kind of stuff. They can do the John Collins deal with or without those guys. They can re-sign Jordan Clarkson with or without doing the John Collins deal. I just think obviously it prevents them from making a max money offer elsewhere, but you can even still do stuff like give $100 million to Austin Reeves if you want to. I still think kind of the flexibility is there that this deal, even getting a $25 million contract and a salary dump, they still have all of their cards on the table.
Yeah, and that's important to recognize. Coming into today, before the John Collins trade, I was of the opinion Olynyk would be back, Clarkson would be gone, and one of Sexton or THT would remain on the roster. And then there'd be a priority placed on developing Keontae George. I wonder, because this trade is more of a win now move as opposed to, and it's not like a win immediately move, but it's more win now than if they'd kept the current roster, prioritized the development of Hendricks and George, if that changes things. So if Jordan Clarkson goes, I still think one of THT and Collin Sexton would have to be elsewhere, just because there's too many guards, and then it takes away the chance for development for someone like Keontae George, like Bryce Sensabaugh. Collin Sexton's is a little more difficult. He's got $18 million for 3 more years. THT's is obviously opt in or opt out, and it becomes simple if THT were to opt out, and then it's you probably keep Sexton. What would a trade look like for Collin Sexton? Because I feel like you'd almost get pennies on the dollar because you'd kind of know that they have to trade him at that point.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to get a lot for Collin Sexton on the market. We did hear the rumor that, the Jazz are at least open to trading Collin. I think that does make sense. I think they'd be willing to trade Taylor as well if he chooses to opt in. But I don't think that there's a lot of, interested suitors in either of those players, given that they haven't really contributed to winning basketball a ton. Certainly Collin Sexton in his Cleveland career, that the Cavs were worse when he was on the floor. Taylor, was a little bit the Jazz's tank brigader last year. Like, let's be honest. I think he had some bright performances in there, and still also it's really hard to win with a, 28% shooting point guard in the NBA. So I think ultimately those guys are more interesting to rebuilding teams, and those rebuilding teams will probably not want to give up any draft assets or kind of assets that the Jazz would be interested in, unless you're just kind of going full in on a star. If you really wanted to trade for Damian Lillard or something, then maybe like Taylor Horton-Tucker is interesting to them. But in the end, they're still going to be more interested in Lauri Markkanen or Taylor Hendricks or the 5 future first-round picks that the Jazz are going to get. So, truthfully, I don't see it as that big of a logjam. I'm going to be honest. Like, I just think you don't need to play Taylor, and I think you can play Collin 20 to 25 minutes a night and be okay. You do have Chris Dunn there, but again, you don't need to play Chris Dunn given that he's a G League guy. I'm fine with kind of giving, Collin Sexton the starting point guard role, 25 minutes a night, and then distributing the remaining 23 minutes a night to some combination of Taylor Horton-Tucker, Keontae George, Chris Dunn, kind of whoever's healthy and playing the best.
It's interesting. I think I see it the opposite way, but I come to the same conclusion. I see that Sexton is a 2 guard that is trapped within a 6'1" body. So I'd almost rather play someone like Chris Dunn at my point guard. And I'm not saying long term, but in the short term, play him at the point guard, play with Agbaji, and then the front court of Kessler, Markkanen, and Collins. And then I'd prioritize having THT or Sexton elsewhere, and then try to improve the chances that Keontae George is that guy, because I think he's got more of a chance of being that guy that the Jazz want him to be if they give him the chance immediately. So the last question for you here would be, is there a world where all 3 of THT, Collin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson are on the team, and Keontae George and Bryce Sensabaugh and Chris Dunn are as well? Like, that would be 6 guards right there.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I might even say that's the most likely option. I guess maybe with the exception of Taylor Horton-Tucker. Look, I mean, the Jazz did give his number 0 away to Taylor Hendricks. I
won't lie, I was encouraged.
Yeah, we'll see. What that means. I think maybe we'll see if Taylor opts out. Right, like that is the big question he has to make for his future. But I think there's a possibility there. So. But no, I do think that there is a world in where, you do have all 6 of those guards, and those are, honestly, very interesting pieces to have for your, I think 13 through 15 kind of guards on the roster, or at least, your guards 4 through 7 on the roster, depending on how you count Agbaji. But I'm personally fine with that, given Keontae and Bryce's youth being 19, given that you do have the G League for one or multiple of those guys if you want, and the fact that like you don't feel like the need to play Chris Dunn, for example, right? Like even though Chris Dunn's really good, I don't think again he's going to complain if you don't play him minutes. He's just going to be happy to be in the NBA.
Yeah, and I said last question, I've got one final one. Who are players that the Jazz, and this is a tease for tomorrow, so every day tune in. I'm going to talk about the free agency. I'm going to see if this jogs your guys' mind as well as my own. Who are players that you would look into that fit free agency, especially now with the Jazz having John Collins and indicating a more win now mindset?
Is it crazy that I would think about Dylan Brooks at a cheap contract? Like, look, kid's
I like the idea.
Was a second team all defense guy, takes completely awful shots. And yet, like, Will Hardy was pretty good last year at getting guys to take good shots. Some bad shot takers to lower their usage a little bit, find more open, people on for passes. He lowered Jordan Clarkson's usage. He lowered Collin Sexton's usage last year. I think about it. I think about it at a cheap, I'm not going to pay $20 million a year for Dylan Brooks or even maybe 15, but under that, I start to think about like, hey, that's just kind of good value for a 27-year-old who, again, has the tools that he has. I think there's some like young upside plays. I actually just made a list, like I like Javon Carter as kind of an interesting idea. Josh Okogie, if you can kind of work with him on development. Jalen Noel from Minnesota. Jalen McDaniels, speaking of Jalen's, another kind of interesting end of roster guy if you can get him on a cheap deal. Troy Brown Jr. is still, I think, either 23 or 24 and had a decent season with the Lakers. Like, I kind of like the idea of getting these young, again, 22, 23, 24-year-olds on kind of second draft contracts and seeing what you can do with them as they get over kind of their rookie selves and start to figure out what it is they do at the NBA level. Goga Bitadze from Indiana, was not great in Indiana and then, moved to Orlando. Can you make him your third center and see what you have there? Because I think he's pretty talented. I think there are some guys out there. Keita Bates-Diop contributed for the Spurs last year. Would you spend money on Gabe Vincent, who himself is kind of a young guy, but I guess now in his prime,
I had him on my list all year, and then I think he played himself out of my price range.
I agree. I think he probably is too expensive now, but again, you look at what the dollar value is going to be. Dante DiVincenzo had a decent year for the Warriors. I think there are some actually for a team that's not going to contend next year, but is looking for pieces that might help moving down the road. I think there are a lot of those guys in the 22 to 28-year-old range that could really be part of the next Jazz team that while you have cap space and they're movable deals, you look at who you can get a bargain on and make some moves.
And we're thinking of the same mind. I mentioned Kelly Oubre on a more luxury value, and one other one I thought of was Lonnie Walker, but he also may have played himself into a higher price range. But thanks again, Andy, for hopping on. Love hearing what you have to say. For those of you who don't read the Salt Lake Tribune, I highly recommend it. Read Andy and Eric's work. Thank you again, and thanks for making Locked On Jazz your first listen with your second. Check out Locked On NBA Big Board, which I contribute to, but in this case, listen to Rafael Barlow and Richard Stayman, who are at the NBA draft, and they'll discuss who were the winners. Maybe the Jazz will be one. I don't know. I haven't talked to them about it, but I think the Jazz could be considered winners. Until next time, have a great day, and as always, go Jazz.